I'm especially pleased to introduce Simon LeVay today. My very first week in graduate school, I saw some odd radiograms that Simon had made that really, I still remember this day learning, what he had found using neuroanatomy. It was really cutting edge stuff. It was really, for a young psychology graduate student, it was really sort of stunning what he had done. Simon was originally born in Oxford, England, and he wanted to go away for college, so he went to Cambridge instead to get his bachelor's degree. And then he went to the University of Göttingen in Germany to get a Ph.D. in neuroanatomy, where he wrote his dissertation, or at least the title's in German. I suppose the whole dissertation is in German. And then went to do a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard University, working with Yuval and Wiesel, who would later win the Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology. He, after teaching at Harvard for a while, he eventually decided he wanted to see the other coast of America, and took a position at the Salk Institute, where in 1991 he published a paper that you're going to hear about, and many of you have heard about before. That was one of the things he's talking about. I got to meet Simon for the first time when we were both working with a publisher at MIT Press, and she invited us both to dinner at New Orleans at a Society for Neuroscience meeting that was there. And I had been thinking about that maybe I would try to write a book about, the biology of sexual orientation. Well, sitting down there with Simon, I learned that he was thinking about writing such a book too. And I thought that was, we had a very nice time. Of course, I'd been an admirer of his work for years. And then, amazing, like 6 weeks later, the editor sent me the finished manuscript to read, to review. It was just, and I was still thinking about maybe, and here it is, I don't know, 20 years later, and I'm still just thinking about it. Writing, and you're watching me think about it here. This is sort of what, so maybe I'm finally going to do something about it. Anyway, so I'm delighted to have him here, and I know you're going to learn some interesting things, and then we'll have a good time. So please welcome Dr. Simon LeVay.
Oh, it says freeze up there, but that's the way it's right now. Let's see.
Well,
Okay.
It's confusing because it needs to say freeze off. Let's see. I think that's it.
Okay. One more rehearsal would have got this. Anyway. All right. Thank you very much, Mark. Very pleased to be here as part of this series. To be honest, I do quite a lot of lecturing in this area, but usually I give a very general lecture that covers the whole sort of topic of the science of sexual orientation, pretty much similar to what is covered in my book. This is not the book that Mark was talking about. This is a book that actually came out last year, so it's a little more current than that first book. But I couldn't give that talk this time because it's part of a series, and most of the stuff I talk about is being talked about by other people in the series. And I can't talk about my own research because I haven't had a lab now for 20 years. So I was a bit of a quandary, and I decided in the end that as a retired scientist, I was entitled to sort of waffle a bit about what everything means. And I would give a talk about sexual orientation, science, and society. So what I'm going to do is start off by just summarizing a sort of basic model that might be a sort of common idea about how biology influences human sexual orientation, and then go on to talk about how, what kind of effects this kind of research might have, or might not have, or should not have on public attitudes towards gay people. Now, so here's the very bare bones of a biological model, a little flow chart that probably corresponds to, roughly speaking, what most of the speakers in this series would agree is a kind of skeleton of what's going on here. So we have in this model, the levels of testosterone circulating in the blood of an animal, either prenatally, probably in humans, or in some early developmental period that in rats might be around the time of birth, influences the sexual differentiation of several regions of the brain, high levels tending to drive development in a male typical direction, low levels tending to allow the brain to follow its own endogenous developmental pathway, which would be a female typical direction. And that this differentiation of various circuits in the brain, eventually, when the animal's postnatal or adult, influences the expression of a variety of gendered traits, including sexual orientation. So that's a sort of basic pathway, if you like, and it comes from a variety of sources. Certainly early animal experiments, people like Roger Gorski, certainly Mark Breedlove contributed to, many others. This it's been well documented now that testosterone levels during this early critical period does influence the sexual differentiation of the brain and does influence gender traits. Whether that includes sexual orientation remains to be seen. So, let me go back here. Sorry, I'm hitting too many buttons here at once. All right. So part of the evidence comes from animal studies where you can manipulate prenatal testosterone levels and produce gendered behavior that's maybe sex atypical. Partly comes from observations in humans where nature has basically done that experiment for you. Conditions like congenital adrenal hyperplasia, where a female fetus is exposed to unusually high levels of male-like sex hormones, androgens, where you have anatomical. Sorry about this. Why don't I just stick to this one here? Where you have a condition like congenital adrenal hyperplasia, where you have anatomical effects and also psychological effects on a variety of gender traits of a female fetus being exposed to higher than usual levels of testosterone-like hormones. And from the existence of various markers in adults, such as, I believe, were talked about in a previous lecture about the auditory system, where you have traces of apparently different hormonal exposures that remain sort of detectable in the way that the auditory system operates. Also, traces in finger ratios, for example, something that Mark has worked on, all pointing towards this general kind of pattern. Now, of course, what this little model doesn't tell you is what goes forward. This explains what's different between males and females, if you like, because we know that prenatal testosterone levels are typically higher in males than in females. But what about differences within one sex, such as between gay and straight people of the same sex? How can you invoke the same model? Well, or rather, what factors are feeding into this pathway to kind of influence it to move in different directions? One possibility, of course, is that genes influence this pathway, and we know at least one set of genes that does this. This is the genes that are responsible for that condition of congenital adrenal hyperplasia. But on the basis of twin studies and other studies by Mike Bailey and others, we know that there's probably many more genes that are influencing sexual orientation, but we don't know what those genes are or how they work. So that's a kind of unanswered question. In addition, there's the possibility that environmental influences feed back into this system. There's animal studies, for example, which show that prenatal stress on rats can influence the anatomical development of those animals and also influence their ultimate sexual behavior. The relevance of that to human sexual orientation has been disputed, but currently the most recent studies suggest that's not a factor in human sexual orientation. And then lastly, there are purely random factors that seem to play a role in development. We tend to think of human development as being fairly deterministic. We think that it's rather, sorting letters into mailboxes, the sort of labels on all the parts of our body that direct them to go to certain places and to adopt certain fates. But in fact, of course, there's also stochastic processes which include a significant random element, more like throwing darts at a dartboard, so that you have, the darts end up in a general region, but because there's a random element in it, they end at varying distances from the target, and some of them may even end up at a completely different dartboard. So these stochastic, the random elements could be very basic phenomena such as such a thermal noise, that influences the dwell time of ion channels. Or it could be much higher level factors. And one factor that comes into mind, one illustration of that, is the so-called uterine contiguity effect, which was first discovered here by Lynn Clemens quite a few years ago. And this is the effect that you're probably aware of, that in animals where you have multiple fetuses in the same uterus, that if you have a female surrounded by a couple of males, she absorbs some of the testosterone that diffuses out of those males, and that influences, slightly masculinizes the development of that female, both in terms of her anatomy and her behavior. And that is an example of a random process, because after all, it's completely a throw of the dice whether you end up, next to a male or next to a female. It's just a matter of, which sperm and so forth. So there's a lot that's not predictable in development, and we should be aware of that and keep in mind that we won't necessarily be able to find an ultimate explanation of every aspect of our nature, if you like. So that's, if you like, the basic model. And now I want to switch gears and talk about how, given that there is some truth to this basic model, what does it say about gay people such as myself? How should we be treated by society? How should gay people be thought about? Should this kind of science affect the laws and on topics such as gay marriage and so forth? Well, the first way in which this kind of scientific or biological approach to the topic has been practiced, if you like, is by drawing moral arguments from nature. And this is something that goes way back. Really, the founder of this whole sort of school of thought was St. Thomas Aquinas back in the 13th century. Here is Thomas, and what's happening here, this is a painting by Velázquez, and Thomas has just been tempted with this very pretty young prostitute who was sent by his older brother, who thought evidently that Thomas was too much of a sanctimonious prig and he needed to be sort of, livened up a little bit. But Thomas grabbed this flaming log here. You can't see it very well in the light, and he drove out the prostitute. And now he's fainting into the arms of this rather attractive young male angel, while this second male angel here is just about to gird him with the mystical girdle of chastity. So St. Thomas is known primarily for his five proofs of the existence of God, but he also laid down basically the sexual ethics that form the foundation of Catholic attitudes towards sexuality today. And Aquinas thought that you could figure out what was natural by looking at nature, by looking at animal behavior. You could figure out what was natural for humanity and therefore what was right. And so a lot of his arguments were based on animal behavior. And he said that what you saw in nature was heterosexual monogamy. So this is the first anti-gay argument from nature. The idea that animals don't do it, so it's unnatural. And that's also implicit in many sort of stories and legends, such as the story of Noah's Ark, which is depicted here. And so the idea you've got Mr. and Mrs. Elephant, Mr. and Mrs. Butterfly, and so forth. And that's the kind of universal thing you see. Therefore, it must be applicable to humans too. And therefore, any other kind of sex, whether it be homosexual or whether it be adultery or whatever, is sinful for that reason. Those of you who are biologists may notice that these two deer here both have antlers, which means that we have a somehow or other gay male deer couple found its way onto. I won't pretend to understand how they got past Noah onto the ark, or how they managed to reproduce their species after they get off. Let's leave that issue and move along here. So that's one sort of one way in which observations of animals, or supposed observations of animals, led to sort of thoughts about what was right or wrong for human beings. And this sort of idea is still echoed today. For example, the Grand Ayatollah Abdullah Javadi Amoli, who's a very high-level cleric in Iran, said quite recently this year Even animals, dogs and pigs, don't engage in this disgusting act. He was referring to homosexuality. But yet they, which are Western politicians, pass laws in favor of them in their parliaments. So he's saying, you know, this is clearly wrong for humans because, you know, even animals in their ignorance don't engage in that kind of behavior. Now, another sort of countervailing argument was that animals do engage in this kind of behavior, and they do, and so it's a bestial behavior. And this sort of idea was, I just found this little piece on the internet which expressed this point of view. This comes from a lay preacher somewhere in the backwoods of Tennessee, and he said, oh God, sorry about that. Yeah, that homosexual activity is unnatural due to the very perverted nature of the act itself. Yes, there are plenty of animals that give way into uncontrolled lust. What's your point? People should have the right to act like animals? So he's taking exactly the opposite point of view to say Aquinas, and saying we should distinguish ourselves from all the disgusting stuff that goes on in the animal kingdom. And then finally, there's people who say some animals do it, but those are the unclean animals. And of course, the archetypal unclean animal is the hyena. And you have it right here at MSU, one of the world's leading experts, of course, on hyenas, Professor Kate Holekamp. And so you probably know a lot about this yourselves. This is a page from a 12th century bestiary or a collection of moral fables based on the behavior of animals. And the hyena have long been accused of engaging in gay sex and also of changing sex, of being transgender. So this monk has drawn two male hyenas sort of getting it on. And in his tact, he hasn't actually shown any genital contact. He's showing it more as a sort of hyena bromance or something. You know, they're sort of hugging each other, rather like Aquinas and the angel. And in fact, he hasn't shown genitals at all, which is a pity because that's really the focus of what's going on. And this photograph, which I think probably comes from someone in Professor Holekamp's group, shows a female spotted hyena with her what scientists call a pseudo penis. I'm sure she herself doesn't think of it that way, but it's a clitoris that's very enlarged, erectile, and makes it difficult to distinguish males from females in the wild. So and also, it appears and disappears. So the thought arose that these animals changed sex, and also that you had two males having sex together. It was just a total confusion. These are probably, in the end, pretty heterosexual animals. So that's just an example of people selecting out one particular species as being, especially reprehensible. Now, there are also pro-gay arguments from animal world, and let's go through some of these. Animals don't do it because they're stupid, and here I found a nice quote in John Boswell's book. Oh, God, if I can't again, so. I found this quote in John Boswell's book, Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality. This is from Lucian, who's a philosopher from the 2nd century, either from him or one of his students. Is it any wonder that since animals have been condemned by nature not to receive from the bounty of Providence any of the gifts afforded by intellect, they have with all else been deprived of gay desires? Lions do not have such a love because they are not philosophers either. All right, so there was someone presumably gay, trying to draw the conclusion that the fact that animals don't engage in gay sex is just proves a wonderful thing that gay sex is. Alternatively, they might say animals do it, so that's a proof that it's natural. So here we have, quite recently, a whole bunch of books from various people. Bruce Bogomil, for example, wrote that book, Biological Exuberance, and there are several others. Joan Roughgarden had a book that talks about homosexuality and also transgender, where they're portraying the tremendous amount of homosexual behavior that's out there in the animal kingdom. And the subtext of these books, I think you'd have to say, is really sort of to justify homosexuality and transgender in our species by reference to this sort of wider world of gay sex that happens out there. And that may not be the motives of everyone who wrote these books, but certainly you see quotes like this one from Bruce saying the implications for humans of his book, or these findings, are enormous. And what implications would there be other than saying, that being gay is natural and therefore is totally cool for humans too. And they may even say that some animals do it, and those are the lovable ones. And certainly, you're probably familiar, it's a bit dark, this slide, but this is two of our oversexed primate relatives, the bonobos, or pygmy chimpanzees, two females going at it. I think this was photographed by Amy Parrish in San Diego Wild Animal Park. And you see these are their clitorises that are wonderfully large and erectile in the species. They rub across for about 5 or 8 seconds till they reach orgasm. Same to females engaging a bit of sort of post-coital bonding here, while some juvenile males vaguely harass them. So people appeal to these specific lovable species as being the ones where you see a lot of gay sex. So this must be, an example of how cool it is for humans too. Well, my conclusion is all these arguments are fallacious. Basically, there's nothing you can conclude logically or ethically from animal behavior that tells you how humans should or should not behave. And you can pick and choose if you like and draw the conclusions you want to, but it's not really convincing. And I say it with all due apologies to St. Thomas Aquinas, but I don't think today any moral philosopher would say that the behavior of animals really has anything to teach us about how we should behave, whether in sexuality or any other realm. And the other reason for being a bit skeptical about this whole thing, even those books by Bruce Bogomil and so on, is that mostly they're talking about sexual behavior. They're talking about animals that sometime or other engage in same-sex behavior. They're not talking about the fact that an individual animal over its lifetime would have a preference to engage in same-sex contacts, even when it had an opportunity to have sex with an opposite-sex partner. Now that, as far as we know, is pretty unusual. Now it does happen in one species you know about, and that's sheep, and you've already had a talk about that, and that's a very interesting example. Although even then, you could argue that because you're dealing with a domesticated species, because this hasn't been clearly documented in wild sheep, because you're dealing with a domesticated species, you're therefore dealing with a species where there may be genes being selected for female fecundity, which have a sort of byproduct of causing a certain amount of same-sex behavior among males. This is a kind of theory that has been brought forward to possibly explain the persistence of gay genes in humans, what's called a sexually antagonistic effect. I don't know. But my point is then that if we talk about sexual orientation as an underlying predisposition to experience sexual attraction to one species or another, all these animal observations that I've talked about before really are pretty irrelevant. All right. Now, so what about the possible effects of this kind of research? Now, quite a few people have said to me, with a lot of justification, that there's a risk that this kind of research will really worsen people's attitudes towards homosexuality, in the idea that it'll go back to a time when we thought of homosexuality as some sort of disorder and something needed to be treated or prevented, and that it might actually lead to potential methods of quote curing. Of course, it's not, in my mind, not a disorder that needs to be cured, but in some people's minds, would be something perhaps that should be cured, and that perhaps the biology would provide the tools to do that. Or else, some preventive methodology such as scanning embryos for genes that might be predisposed for the embryo to become gay and so forth. And I certainly don't dismiss those fears. They are real ones. If we look at the history of thought about sexual orientation and homosexuality, we see this constant, or nearly always, an effort to connect theories about causation to efforts to cure homosexuality. Certainly with regard to Freudian theories. Freud himself probably wasn't particularly homophobic, but his ideas that certainly certain family relationships, such as a distant or hostile father, might promote homosexuality in his son, or close binding mother, and that kind of thing. These psychodynamic models were very influential in promoting the development of treatment modalities throughout the 20th century that were quite ineffective, first of all, but also quite destructive, I would say. And if you read a book such as this book by Martin Duberman called Cures, A Gay Man's Odyssey, Duberman, when he was a young man, very much wanted to become straight, and he went through a whole sequence of treatments with psychoanalysts and other forms of therapists, where he was desperately trying to cure himself of his disorder as he thought about it, without any success. Eventually, he saw the error of his ways, and then he became a very sort of proud gay activist, and he founded the Center for Gay and Lesbian Studies at the City University of New York. So there was a happy ending for him in that way. But certainly, many men were severely traumatized. Some women too, but most of this therapy was aimed at men. And this still goes on. This guy, Joseph Nicolosi, you may have heard of him, he is a therapist who works very much in the Freudian tradition, very much believes in the idea that parent-child relationships are responsible for a child becoming gay. And he works out of, believe it or not, the Thomas Aquinas Psychological Clinic in Encino, California. So you can see that there's that much maligned medieval philosopher is still alive and well on Ventura Boulevard. Joseph Nicolosi, so he practices reparative therapy, as he calls it, trying to convert gay people to heterosexuality. And you may know that a law was just passed in California that on January the 1st will make it illegal to practice such therapy on minors. So I'm sure Nicolosi is working night and day right now to complete, his therapeutic procedures on everyone before the year is out, before midnight on December 31st, when it'll become a crime to do that. Okay, so there has been this tendency to use this sort of scientific ways of looking at sexual orientation to kind of oppress gay people, basically. And that's not just in these psychodynamic models, actually. Magnus Hirschfeld, who you might not have heard of, he was a contemporary of Freud. He was a gay man, a gay activist, actually. He founded the first gay rights organization in Berlin about 100 years ago. And Hirschfeld argued completely opposite. He said sexual orientation is a biological process determined by hormones, genes, and brain development, a biological model. He didn't really have a lot of evidence for it back then. There wasn't really the technology, but certainly, that's the argument he made, and he used that argument as a sort of tool in his campaign to have the sodomy statutes annulled, so that gay people could have sex legally. Yet, over the last century, biological methods were used also in many what I consider destructive attempts to cure gay people. Actually, Hirschfeld himself sent some of his patients to Eugen Steinach, who was a German neuroendocrinologist, who thought he could cure gay people by transplanting the testicles of heterosexual people into them. So he'd castrate a gay man, implant a testicle from a straight man in his abdomen. Yeah, I see your expression there. It's absolutely, I share your revulsion completely. But this was what they thought back then. And it didn't work, of course. First of all, the castration actually basically eliminated these men's sexual feelings altogether. The grafted testosterone might secrete, the grafted testis, oh my God, the grafted testis might secrete testosterone for a short time, but then it was quickly destroyed by the immune system. So these men basically ended up as sort of eunuchs. But after this time, there was many attempts to cure gay people through hormone treatments, various brain operations, and so forth. So the biological approach was not, an entirely blissful one in terms of the way it was interpreted and used. Of course, I'm talking very much from the perspective of a gay man who thinks that, being gay is totally cool and the world would be a better place, the more gay people we had and so forth. But so I have that sort of, twisted perspective, if you like, on the subject. But still, I think most of you would agree that these kinds of ways of looking at sexual orientation are really not very fruitful, and they do violate the human rights, I think, of a significant fraction of the population. Now, so most people have sort of gotten past this, but there's still, it does remain behind this fear that the technology will be used this way. And even some gay people still, actually like the idea they might be able to be cured by some sort of biological method. I mean, it's horrible to think that, but here's, here's, I had another slide somewhere. No. Yeah, this one actually. This I picked up from a British bulletin board on Yahoo Answers, and it's some guy called Alexei who says, "What went wrong in my brain that made me gay, but not my brothers or dad? It's actually not fair. I don't want to be gay. I want children, my real children. But that won't happen now, will it? I do think gay is wrong. If I could turn straight, I would." Well, I almost cried with vexation when I saw this posting. It's pretty depressing to see a gay guy have this sort of attitude. It seemed like he's starting off from the belief that being gay is wrong, and then he's going back and sort of distancing himself from his own sexual orientation by saying it's something in my brain. In the same way that someone with a brain tumor, or perhaps with Parkinson's disease, or maybe even some psychiatric conditions like schizophrenia or depression might distance himself from their condition and say, no, that's my brain, it's not me, and it's my brain's fault. And of course, it's a very simple jump from this to say, well, let's fix my brain and see if we can cure myself or gay people by that kind of technology. Now let me go back a bit here. Oh, yeah, and just say there, and then this brings up the question of free will, of course, because when you say, something's happening in your brain, but you're looking into it from the outside, well, most of us now think of, our minds as being the operation of our brain, so it's kind of a weird idea to think about yourself as being really separate from your brain, and what's going on in your brain is not something you're responsible for. And this is an issue that's, neurophilosophers talk about a lot these days. There's a very nice book written by Elise Sternberg called My Brain Made Me Do It, and you can see I've sort of stolen that idea for the title of my talk, which discusses the relationship between free will and neuroscience. He actually comes to the conclusion that free will does exist. I think it doesn't exist, but we do best to assume that it does. So I take a little bit of a difference from him in my take on the whole thing. Anyway, going back now, this is this guy, Jonathan Tolins here, playwright. Shortly after my study was published in 1991, he wrote a play called The Twilight of the Goals, which is, it says here, if you knew that your child was going to be gay. And it's set a little bit in the future. And the premise is you have this very hip sort of New York couple here. You can see the IKEA furniture and stuff. And and she's pregnant. She's told by a doctor who has scanned the hypothalamus of her fetus and also done DNA testing of the fetus, that she's told that her child is a boy who is going to be a gay man. And so the whole play is her and her husband agonizing over what to do about it. And she has a gay brother who she loves, who is trying to dissuade her, saying you should be happy to have a gay kid. But in the end, and this is a bit of a spoiler alert, she does decide to abort the kid. So what Jonathan Tolins is saying in this play is this kind of science really is dangerous. It's going to lead to the adoption of technology to actually prevent gay people even being born in the first place. Well, in response to that, Jonathan comped me to the premiere of this play. So I was sitting in the front row of the audience, kind of grinding my teeth in vexation a little bit, at what was going on in this play. And to be honest, I was kind of glad that his play folded after about 10 performances, I think. But it kind of in response to that, I wrote my own bit of fiction, a novel called Ulbricht's Goldfish, which also discussed a future in which it was possible to do this kind of thing, but with a kind of rather different outcome. Anyway, a few years later, Jonathan rewrote his play for television, and then he changed the ending completely. And this is another spoiler alert now, he had the couple decide they would have the kid after all, and they'd be very happy to have a gay kid. So he went through this epiphany apparently over a period of about 5 years, whereby perhaps because his play didn't do very well and thought it would sell better with a happy ending, he decided that maybe at least some people might decide that they'd be okay with having a gay kid. Now, I don't want to sort of poke fun at this point of view totally. I mean, it's a significant issue. There are obviously some corners of this country, and certainly some countries outside of North America, where if the technology existed to prevent a gay kid being born, that certainly at this point would be used. I mean, we know that technology to avoid having a girl being born is used massively in some parts of the world. So how much more would the ability to prevent a gay kid being born? Anyway, so that's something definitely to worry about. Now, the other possibility, though, is there might be some positive effect of this kind of research on people's attitudes towards gay people and gay rights. And the reason I think that is because there's a connection between what people think about how people come to be gay, their thoughts about causation on the one hand, and on the other hand, their attitudes to how gay people should be treated in society on such issues as gay marriage. And here's just one example of that. This is when North Carolina was voting on an anti-gay marriage initiative earlier this year. And Joe Easterling, a devout Christian, voted for the amendment at a polling place. So he was voting on the anti-gay side at a polling place in Wake Forest. He said, I think it's important that the state of North Carolina's laws are compatible with the laws of nature, but more importantly with the laws of God. So he was saying homosexuality is a sin, basically, because it's forbidden in the Bible. So it's a choice, and it's a wrong choice. And it's also unnatural. Whereas another person, Linda Toano, and I'm not quite sure how to pronounce her name, who voted against the amendment, so she was on the pro-gay side, said people are born gay, and it is not their choice. We think everybody should have the same rights as everyone else. If you're gay, lesbian, straight, whatever, she said. Well, I did a quick Google search on her, and I found she was a member of the Wake Forest Daredevils wrestling team. So she's not someone you'd want to mess with. And even though she lost this particular election, I'm sure she will be continuing to fight the good fight in the future. So we'll look out for her. Now, so those are just two individuals to give you some idea of attitudes. What about if you do some surveys? Well, here's a survey done about 9 years ago now by the New York Times. First asked people about homosexuality. Do you think it's a choice or is it not something that people choose? And at that time, at least, the American population broke down about something like 50-50 on that. I can't remember exact numbers. But the interesting thing is that they then asked these same people, do you think gay sex should be legal? And do you think same-sex marriage should be legal? And what you can see is the Choice Brigade were very much less likely to think those things should be legal as compared to those people who thought it was not a choice. A huge difference, a very tight correlation between beliefs about causation and attitudes to issues of gay rights and gay sex. Now, and this is true actually not just for gay sex and gay marriage. They also ask questions like, would you like to have your child taught by a gay teacher? And again, this was the same sort of thing. And that's sort of understandable in a way, because if you don't want your child to be gay, and you think that perhaps it's something they could be influenced to be gay by a teacher, promoting homosexuality, then you wouldn't want him to be taught by a gay teacher. Whereas if you thought it was not a choice, then it really wouldn't matter. But they also asked questions like, would you mind flying in a plane flown by a gay pilot? And it's the same thing. The Choice Brigade did not want to be flying with a gay pilot. Now, this is more mysterious because, after all, how often does a gay pilot or even a straight pilot have the opportunity to influence the sexual orientation of his passengers? It's never happened in my experience. So, presumably, the fact that these Choice Brigade did not want to fly with a gay pilot is either motivated by some dislike of gay people, which made them want to deny them employment opportunities, or perhaps some negative beliefs about gay people, such as perhaps that a gay pilot wouldn't be able to find his way from one airport to the other without stopping to ask for directions. I don't know. In any case, So it's a very strong and persistent connection. Now, is it a causal thing? Is it the case that if you have beliefs about that being gay is a choice, then that kind of predisposes you to not to like gay people, and vice versa if you believe it's a choice? Or is it just some sort of correlation that's not causal? One way you can ask that is simply by asking how this changes over time. You know, if you look at polls over, as the decades go by, what do you see? Well, here's a poll from Gallup. And this is from 1977 to the present. And just look at this dark green line. This is the fraction of the American population, the percentage of the American population who think that gay people are born that way. Goes very low numbers in the 70s up to about low 40s at present, right? Sort of gradual increase. And if you look at this graph, this is asking the same people over the same period of time, do you think gay or lesbian relations between consenting adults should be legal? And the yes people are, again, the dark green. And you can see, again, this steady increase in approval of gay sex over time. But this is a much more sort of jittery curve. You can see a big deflection here in the mid-'80s, a worsening, if you like, of attitudes, almost certainly connected with the AIDS epidemic. And then another jitter here in the around 2003 that's probably tied in with the Supreme Court ruling in the case of Lawrence versus Texas, which was the ruling that said that states could not ban gay sex. So there's a general sort of relationship between the two, but it's not a very tight relationship, and it's not totally clear from something like this that, that they're so closely tied that there might be a causal connection. One way you can try and get even closer is by studying it experimentally, like psychologists love to do. So you grab a bunch of students in your psych class, and you get half of them to read material suggesting there's a biological basis for homosexuality. You get half of them to read materials that suggest there is not a biological, that it's something else. And then later you test them, you ask them about their attitudes on gay marriage or whatever, or whether gay sex is okay. And there have been several studies in this vein. The first one was done by Janet Pisker and Doug Dagelman in 1992 at Vanguard University. And they found a positive result, that the students who read the biological material ended up significantly more gay-friendly when they were quizzed later as compared with the students who read the non-biological material. But then this was followed by another study by Pratarelli and Donaldson at the University of Oklahoma State in '97, where they did pretty much the same study, but they found no effect. The students just didn't change. And then a final, much more recent study was done by Boysen and Fogel at Iowa State, I believe. And they did it slightly differently. They measured the students' attitudes towards gay people initially, then they exposed them to the biological material, and then they measured attitudes again later. And what they found was that if people were sort of anti-gay attitudes at the beginning, then if they saw this material, they were actually made more anti-gay. And similarly, the pro-gay people at the beginning were made more pro-gay. So reading this material simply strengthened the biases that people already had. So, and this perhaps partly explains the discrepancy between these two earlier studies, because this study was done in California, which was probably a more gay-friendly student body compared to the students in Oklahoma that might have included considerable numbers of people who had traditional negative views of homosexuality. So these studies don't really provide a clear answer. I wouldn't say it's clear at this point. It hasn't really been proven that there's a causal connection between beliefs and attitudes. I suspect there is some connection, but it's not really a fully documented case, if you like. Now, the last kind of topic I want to talk about is more the sort of legal and constitutional angles on this. Is it constitutional for a law to set a group of people at a disadvantage? For example, to say that gay couples cannot marry. This is a hot topic right now, obviously, with 4 gay marriage initiatives up for popular votes a week from tomorrow. Now, this sort of brings in issues of the 14th Amendment and equal protection doctrine. And the Supreme Court over the years, because the 14th Amendment is very vague. It just says, no one should be deprived of the equal protection of the laws. Well, what does that mean? I mean, we certainly deprive criminals of liberty, right? So they're not treated equally as innocent people. So there's clearly some groups who are more equal than others, if you like, in the area of civil liberties. And what the Supreme Court has said over the years is you really have to look at what kind of classification you're talking about when you are deciding what level of protection from governmental oppression a group is entitled to. And the different kinds of groups are entitled to different levels of protection, if you like. So let's look at that. They're called different levels of scrutiny. And the first level, which is called rational basis scrutiny. And this means that a law must bear some rational relationship to a legitimate government purpose. So most classifications qualify this, from age, education, and so on. And in this case, the burden is on the challenger. So for example, if you say that people without a high school education can't sign up for the army, which is the case, I believe, unless you have a GED. So you're denying occupational occupations to one group. Well, this group, people defined by education, are not entitled to any sort of heightened scrutiny, so they're just subject to rational basis. So all the judges have to decide is does it make sense to deny less well-educated people a job in the army? Well, the army says sure, because you require technical skills and so forth, and so that was easily passed a judicial review. Now, the next level is called intermediate scrutiny. And in this case, according to the Supreme Court, the law must bear a substantial relationship to an important government purpose. It's called, and the groups that qualify for this level of scrutiny are called quasi-suspect classification. That's a weird sort of phrase. But the main groups that qualify here are sex and illegitimacy. So in this case, the burden of, so it's a higher standard of proof in the sense you must prove a substantial relationship to important government purpose, and the burden of proof is now on the government rather than on the person who's suing the government. Then the highest level of scrutiny is called strict scrutiny. The law must reflect a compelling government interest, and it must be narrowly tailored to be least restrictive. The burden of proof, again, is on the government, and this is called a suspect classification. The suspect means that courts are required to suspect that any law that puts these people at a disadvantage is a result of prejudice rather than reason, if you like. And the main groups, well, there are several groups here, but examples are race and national origin. So there's been a lot of to and fro over the years about what kind of group we're talking about when we talk about sexual orientation. Does that qualify people only at this basis or this basis or this basis? That makes a huge difference in terms of how easily it is for governments to pass laws such as that gay couples can't marry. And in many gay rights cases over the years, there have been testimony by scientists and psychologists pointing to the idea that there might be a biological evidence for homosexuality. Now, the reason for the relevance of biology is as follows. Here in this slide, which I'm sorry is my last slide, or nearly, and the kind of wordy one, I'm afraid, all of this is a direct quote from the US Court of Appeals that just a few weeks ago in New York ruled that the DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, is unconstitutional. In other words, it's saying that the federal government cannot refuse to recognize legal marriages passed by a single state. And what they said was this. This lower court said the Supreme Court uses certain factors to decide whether a new classification qualifies as a quasi-suspect class. They include whether the class has been historically subjected to discrimination, whether the class has a defining characteristic that frequently bears a relationship to ability to perform or contribute to a society, whether the class exhibits obvious, immutable, or distinguishing characteristics that define them as a discrete group, and whether the class is a minority or politically powerless. So from my point of view, the interesting little word here is immutable. the idea that a class is entitled to heightened protection from discrimination in constitutional law if the group that you're talking about is a one that has a sort of, is discrete from other groups by some label that makes it, not easy to take on, to join or leave the group. And so there's been a lot of discussion in legal cases. A lot of scientists have testified in cases such as the Colorado Amendment 2 case that happened several years ago, an important gay rights case. Dean Hamer, a scientist who had looked for gay genes, he testified at that case. And there have been efforts to use the biology to raise the classification from rational basis to quasi-suspect. And no appeals court level so far has agreed to a heightened classification for gay people until this decision by New York last month. So this decision, these justices argued that all four factors actually do justify heightened scrutiny in the case of sexual orientation. That gay people as a group have historically endured persecution and discrimination. Homosexuality has no relation to aptitude or ability to contribute to society. Homosexuals are a discernible group with non-obvious distinguishing characteristics, especially in the subset of those who enter same-sex marriages, and the class remains a politically weakened minority. So the New York court did not appeal to the biological argument to make this case. They simply took it as a fact, basically, that gay people are a distinct group in society. But I do believe that over the last couple of decades, the science as a whole has tended to push people's ideas in that direction, and thus to make this kind of decision a more possible one. Now, here, just as a wrap-up, basically, I show a quote by Michael Bailey, who's going to be talking here, right, in a short time, and his colleague Richard Pillard. Back in 1991, shortly after my study was published, and also a study by these two guys themselves, an early twin study. And in an op-ed they wrote, should a benevolent view of homosexuality depend on the assumption that it is innate? Are gays and lesbians to be tolerated only if they are born that way? Regardless of what causes sexual orientation, there is no plausible justification for oppressing homosexuals. Now, of course, I believe in that 100%. I think they're absolutely right and very important that they stress that conclusion. I don't believe that we should make the way gay people are treated in society dependent on a certain interpretation of what leads people to be gay or lesbian. Nevertheless, it does seem like in the real world there has been an effect that has been largely beneficial. Now here, largely, sort of as a joke in a way, I plotted from the General Social Survey the percentage of the American population that thinks that gay sex is wrong from 1970 to about 2005. And you see this rather dramatic inflection in about 1991 with a great improvement from my perspective in public attitudes over the following years after my study and all the other science that went on during this time. Now you're probably thinking this is the most self-serving slide that you ever set eyes on. Fair enough. I don't really show this to argue that this is, shows a cause and effect relationship. I really show it to indicate there's no indication of the reverse. There's no indication that all the science that has been done over the last few years has driven people's attitudes in a gay negative direction, if you like. Absolutely not. If there is a beneficial effect, that's fine with me. I'm happy to hear that. But the reason I don't argue that conclusion, of course, is that so much else has happened during this time than science, and particularly activism by gay people themselves. And just to illustrate that, I show some gay rights marches. Here's a march by about 15 very brave gay men and women in the early 1960s. I think at least one of whom lost his job as a result of this demonstration. Here's the first gay rights march on Washington in the 1970s. Actually, me and my then partner were tucked in behind that banner somewhere there. And then in the 1990s, marches with upwards of 1 million people. So it's activism by gay people themselves. It's the fact that the American public has become familiar with gay people in their families, in their schools, in their work environment, and on television and so forth, that has kind of communicated the idea that gay people are actually pretty okay. They're not as threatening, perhaps, and mysterious and dangerous as a lot of people had thought originally. And I'm sure it's this kind of human contact that has had the influence, the major influence in improving people's attitudes towards gay people over the last couple of decades than any amount of science. And I think that's exactly the way that it should be. Thanks very much. Thank you. I'm very happy. Oh, okay. I'm very happy to answer any questions or comments. Anyone wants to weigh in, get their own point of view? Yes, please.
So, let me ask you to wait for the microphone, sir.
You mentioned in your last sentence, you talked about the dangerousness and the mystery of gay people and how that's sort of threatening in and of itself. And I wonder if one of the mechanisms of science, in terms of understanding the condition, is to basically relate to the human condition and sort of demystify it at some level. And even if people don't necessarily want to think about causes, it's just a matter of understanding and lifting sort of the cloak of mystery and danger is part of
I think that's true. Absolutely. I think that the lifting of the veil is the thing that really matters. The fact that you can have a series like this, for example, which 20 or 30 years ago would have been pretty much unheard of. That you can discuss these things on television or whatever is what matters, I think, rather than the specific conclusion you draw about causation. I think that's right. Any other comments that anyone may have? Does anyone think that this kind of science is so dangerous that really we shouldn't pursue it? That it's something that might lead us into very destructive end results? Or
I won't look if you want to raise your hand.
Or anything else?
Any other questions?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to see you present your work here at Michigan State University. Ever since your work was first published in 1991, I'm sure you have received lots of different kinds of responses, both within academia and without. I just wonder if you might be willing to share with us how your view about the place of science in larger society might have changed because of lots of different kinds of responses that your research have received ever since then.
Well, before I engaged in this research, I was a sort of lowly scientist whose work was of no interest to anybody, basically. So I didn't even think that much about the relevance of my work to anything. I mean, it was a subject I was fascinated by, but it had no great relevance to society. It had a little bit of medical implications and so forth. So I never thought about that at all. And when I even published this study, I wasn't even expecting that this study would arouse any public attention. And I was totally surprised, actually, I was saying, when I came to work that morning, I found a whole row of satellite trucks parked outside the Salk Institute. And I slowly dawned on me they might be waiting for me. And so yes, I think it has kind of, if you're asking about my change of heart, it's really made me realize, that what you do as a scientist can be relevant, or people can believe it's relevant, and it's incumbent on scientists themselves to actually, contribute their ideas to the debate. In other words, you don't just publish science and send it off into the blue. You have to some extent, and particularly if you have the opportunity, like I did, to help interpret it and put your spin on it, if you like, and say what you think it means or it doesn't mean. And I think scientists as a whole are kind of reluctant to do that. Too reluctant, actually. I think that, in many fields, scientists feel if they, and particularly in the area of sex, if they get too engaged in the sort of social fallout of their studies, they won't be seen as serious scientists. They'll be seen as sort of propagandists or something like that. That happens with climate scientists, for example. And so I think you have to overcome that and say, no, I'm going to get involved too in the public debate. But also you have to remember that scientists are a very tiny part of the population. They're probably only 1% of the total vote. So scientists cannot dictate what is done with their science. And the person who invented use of ultrasound, to tell the sex of a fetus, that Scottish guy, he was absolutely, he was devastated by what was eventually used by their technology to abort female fetuses, and he kind of basically wished he'd never invented the technology. So you can't control what's done, really, and that is something to worry about.
Let's see, here, and then maybe I'll ask you to come up for the next question.
What can you tell us about parallels between homosexuality in non-human forms as opposed to human forms? Is research being done on that? And so?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's different things. There's sort of lab experiments where you actually manipulate hormones, the sort of things that Mark Breedlove actually is very familiar with, and other people in the audience. So there's these sort of animal models. Now, how close they are to human homosexuality is sort of debatable, because oftentimes, what people are looking at is actually the sexual behavior, the motor patterns of sex, and not the actual, partner preference, if you like. The only animal model that's really a close parallel, I would say, is the sheep model that was talked about by Chuck Roselli a couple of weeks ago. So there you have a species where you have individual animals that naturally have a lifelong preference for sex with same-sex partners. So that does seem to be a good model, as far as we can tell, for human homosexuality, if you like. But I think that's the only really good model that we know about. And, people think of animals, particularly rats, as sort of wind-up toys that work in a very sort of mechanical way, right? And that people are not surprised maybe you can manipulate a rat's behavior and that kind of, with hormones and stuff. People think of us as being humans, as being, above all that stuff. We've gone beyond it. We have culture and so forth. And I think the biology really says that, perhaps we're not that different. There is a underpinning where there are sort of predispositions that really have a biological basis that perhaps are shared between animals and humans.
Did you have a question? I did. Okay. Here and then there.
I was going to ask a couple of things. One, if you think the U.S. is leading in political and social recognition of gay segment of our population, or are we following Western nations? Because the Dutch recognized same-sex marriage since 2000. And the other thing I wanted to ask, if you thought that in the past maybe LGBT people did not seem as threatening to the remaining angry segment of the population because they couldn't reproduce, they had no rights for adoption, and now maybe those people see that as more threatening when those laws start to bend.
Yeah, well, in answer to your first question, no, I wouldn't say that the United States is in the lead. I mean, certainly there are several other countries now, including Canada, obviously, where you can get legally married as a gay person, and also countries where there hasn't been quite the same historical tradition of oppression of gay people. For example, in France, I believe gay sex has been legal since Napoleonic times. And in England, even though gay sex was illegal until the 1960s, nevertheless, there was a very flourishing gay culture that I was familiar with when I was growing up. So it wasn't like here where people my age remembered growing up as a gay guy as a teenager, and they thought they were the only person in the world. They didn't know anything about the phenomenon. There was just nothing talked about. So I don't think that America's ahead of other people. But in the United States has this political tradition of really getting into things and fighting them out. Whereas in Europe, there's a tendency to sort of a little bit sort of glide over them and not sort of not deal with them so explicitly. There's a sort of way in Europe that people sort of allow stuff to happen, as long as we don't look at it too carefully. Here we love to get into it, really figure it out. So that means there's more detailed discourse here actually about the topic than there is in Europe, if you like. And the biology is much more relevant, I would say, here than it is in Europe. People in Europe don't think the biology is really relevant at all to the discourse. Now, so your other question was about, very quickly remind me.
If
legitimate part of the human population, if they're getting more panicked because now there are adoption rights and...
Oh yes, I think that's true. Because you know, the closer you get to equality, you know, the unhappier, you know, people who disapprove of gay people are going to be, and they're going to fight harder, you know, and as they see, you know, the last bastions of homophobia sort of falling, and that is true. Also, if you go far enough back, you know, to a period when people really weren't talking about homosexuality at all, back in the 19th century or so, then actually it was in some ways it was much easier to be gay and to be intimate with same-sex partners, because people, you know, weren't suspecting, they weren't looking for it. You know, you could have women who lived together in these so-called Boston marriages, you know, where they were probably lesbian couples, but no one, you know, thought about it that way. So there was a kind of permissiveness connected to ignorance. And then when it all got dug up by, you know, these sexologists in the late 19th century, then everyone started saying, oh, where are the gay people? You know, we've got to dig them out and fix them. So that actually initially created quite a lot of hostility that hadn't been there before.
So my question is related to the last question.
Yeah.
I'm actually from Holland,
Yes.
so Dutch. There was a study when I was still in Holland that came out also on differences between homo and heterosexual males, done by Dick Swaab.
Yeah.
And I'm delighted how well your study was received, but in this case it was almost the exact opposite. He got demonstrations in his backyard saying that it was a shame that he did these types of things. And this is in Holland, which I think was the first country that legalized homosexual marriage.
Yes.
And I've always been very, very intrigued by who can do these types of studies. I know that when we started doing sex differences research, that was suspect.
Yeah.
And I wonder what your take is on that.
That's very sad because, you know, Holland has been actually a leader in some aspects, particularly in the area of transgender, for example. And I think in Europe, first of all, you know, the memories of the Holocaust have survived a long time and still to some extent influence people's thinking about, you know, the idea of eugenics has been, you know, an absolute, you know, black term, you know, in Europe, and people still think about it that way. So even things like, you know, genetic engineered crops, for example, are not popular in Europe, right? And so I think a lot of that derives from, you know, memories of the Nazi period. I think that's one aspect of it. And then also this strong emphasis on sort of social constructionism and other forms of, other ways of looking at sexuality that don't involve biology. So I think there's a greater fear there of misuse, yes, definitely, than there is here. Although there's definitely voices here, you know, people like Jonathan Tolins, who wrote that play, who again say, you know, this work you shouldn't be doing for that reason. It's too dangerous. Any other comments or questions? If not, I believe we're finished.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.